Okay, I'm going to come back out and take some more questions. I'll come here.
Thank you. The problem when you ask a question later is that it kind of builds on it. I want you to build on what the lady at the back said. So personhood, according to Ann, equals self-awareness, sense of being alive. So you must then determine exactly when that happens, exactly when. Because you go beyond that point, you are self-aware and you should not be killed. So you have to have an exact date, number, definition of that. So it would be interesting to know what that is. And as science advances, if we find out that many of the babies that have been killed were very much self-aware, that would be a horrid thing, would it not? And handicap, deciding a value of a human being depending on the severity of the handicap, again, immensely difficult, especially for those handicapped people that have been born and have a wonderful life, wonderful parents, some have not, just like any child really. And I think the magic that happens when you come out of the womb, it's not really magic. The difference is you see the baby. In the womb, you don't see the baby. And very often people that want to kill dehumanize first, and then they hide what they're doing. And that's the best way, if you want, of getting away with it. That's how I see it. Of course, this could backfire on Peter's or our side as well, because the meaning of a human being, I think, could be changed much more quickly than we would like. So it's in textbooks now, it means this. I think it could quite easily be changed to just say human being is when you're born. So that poses a very difficult point for us when that happens, if it happens.
Okay, I'll come there.
Peter, you've repeatedly asked us to engage with what you're pleased to describe as an argument. So let me do that now. The fundamental problem with what you've put up there is it is a faulty syllogism. There is a logical disconnect between premise 2 and conclusion 1. You say human beings are rational nature. Now what does that mean for a being with no brain? Well, it must mean that they have the potential to develop a rational nature. Well, let's take an example of a child with a genetic disorder that means it will never develop a significant central nervous system. How in any meaningful way does that embryo have a rational nature? You can say, well, it's part of the human species and other members of that group have a rational nature, and so by extension, as membership of that group, it too has a rational nature. But that really is just to assume your conclusion, as has been said repeatedly by a number of the questioners. The reality is, you are asserting that all the members of the group human being have a rational nature, that rational nature gives rise to moral responsibilities, and therefore all human beings have a moral status. But that is the assertion at the start, which is circular. Not all human beings have a rational nature. Embryos don't have a rational nature. People who have severe mental disabilities don't have a rational nature in any meaningful sense. You can assert that, but you need to come up with some justification. And so what you do is you then say, well, look, here's my big high school debating smackdown for the pro-choice people, which is, oh, well, what about people in a coma? How are they sentient? Well, surely that's the problem for you, isn't it? How do they have a rational nature? How do you extend moral status, moral duty to them if they don't have a rational nature? You accuse us of moral duality. Well, I would just accuse you of moral simplicity. The reality is, my moral status as a person arises from a number of sources. It arises from my sentience, my consciousness, my ability to feel pain on one hand. It arises from my personhood, however we choose to define that. It arises from my relationships with other people, my biography. And each of those gives rise to different parts of my moral status and the moral duties and rights owed to me. The moral duties and rights I owe to my wife are different to those I owe to my children, and different again to those I owe to strangers, and different still to those I owe to an embryo. And the reason is because there are different sources. To use duality as a pejorative term is foolish. It fails to recognize the subtlety and multifaceted nature of human nature and human moral status. People at different stages in their life have different moral status. That's why children are allotted different rights and responsibilities. That's why the elderly are given different rights and responsibilities. And that's why embryos should also.
Thank you very much. I'll come over here.
I'd first like to thank you both for a very enjoyable debate. I'd particularly like to thank Anne for very language in this debate, which was not so clear during the 2001 general election, in which you called my mother and other pro-life rights candidates vile scum, amongst other rude things.
Oh, who's your mum?
Madeline Jeremy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
She said worse to me before, don't worry.
So if you say that we have with personhood specific knowing, how can you justify partial birth abortion? How can, say, a baby in the birth canal have less rights to a baby going through the birth canal and then suddenly outside of the womb? I don't see how you can justify morality surrounding that issue.
Okay, I'll come here. I'm going to take everyone who hasn't spoken, and then I'll come back to people who want to speak again. Over here.
Hi, so I have a quick question relating to the difference in the moral status of the woman as opposed to the embryo. So I agree with what you're saying, that they should be, you shouldn't value the embryo above the status of the woman. Like, I completely agree with that. But I would not agree with your conclusion that therefore the woman has the right, sort of due to her autonomy and her moral status, to expel the embryo, fetus, whatever you decide to name it, from her body. Because it seems to me to be a difference between the life or existence of a unique human being and what is essentially sort of the comfort of the woman. Now, I understand that obviously pregnancy can be a trial and it can be very difficult, but it is on the whole 9 months. And yes, it might be 9 horrific months, but it's 9 months compared to the whole life existence of this other human. And I think it's justifiable just to keep it at 9 months, because you do have options of adoption and things like that if you don't feel emotionally, financially, whatever, capable of looking after the child. So just your opinion on that.
Okay. I noticed that whenever anyone asks a question to Anne, they get a round of applause. I hardly think it's fair, but
it's all right. It's a safe space.
it must have. Surely it violates the safe space policy.
Nobody's thrown anything.
No, that's true. We count ourselves lucky. Okay, come here.
I want to ask Anne, with the whole thing of like you say that there is it's morally ambiguous. Considering the moral ambiguity is to do with whether it's a person or not, and whether that person, has equal, if it is a person, and also if that person then has the same rights as everybody else. Isn't that a really important point to get kind of clear before we go down the road of abortion? And and I thought it was quite interesting the point saying that say Peter's arguments are looking. They look metaphysically, or they look at the definition of a person, and the whole thing of the messy reality that is our lives. Sometimes proves to be a lot more difficult than than the moral argument. But at the same time, do we not need? Isn't that really important? And isn't that what the law is about? Isn't that what order in society is about? Is establishing those principles which are clear and which are objective, in order that we're not unnecessarily hurting people. And I think you also said that a woman has to make these choices according to her own conscience. One does I'm not talking here about the cases of rape, for instance, but does not a woman already make that choice? Because we all know what the consequences of having sex are. We're not stupid. So, if you don't want a child, then surely you know the precautions to take, and I think, you can talk about the exception of rape, for instance, but, I think it just seems that, we have to, if we're having to make those conscious choices, are we not just dealing with problems instead of actually dealing with the effects of the problems instead of dealing with the problems themselves?
Okay, can I see who else wants to speak? I know I've got one over there who spoke before, two spoken before. Right, well, I'm going to come back to the panel and then I'll come back out and take those who have spoken before. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I haven't spoken yet, because I'd like to ask Peter about your notion of inherent moral value, which you introduced quite late, and you introduced it as in contrast to social worth. I want to know what you think inherent moral value is.
Inherent sorry.
One sec. One sec. Because that presumably makes you someone, given what we're talking philosophically, it makes you a moral realist. You think that things that we discover what is morally true about the world.
Yes.
You think that there are things there which exist, which are called morals, and that what we do is actually we find out what they are, and then we act upon them.
Yeah.
But then what you did is you used the example of rights, civil rights, and then human rights. You went even further and used the word human rights. But surely human rights and the rights framework that we've created is a system of social worth. It's something that we've created as human beings, as part of our human community, and we've decided to extend certain civil, human rights to other human beings. Do you think that there is moral truth inherent in a thing, and if we discover that moral truth, then we act on it? Or do you think rather that the system of law that we've created is a reflection of social value? And then lastly, you seem to suggest in your example of the ministers in the House of Commons that social value can trump moral value. If you could explain that.
No, I don't think it trumps moral value. What I'm saying is that in that decision, you're not making a decision based on moral value at all. You're making a decision purely based on social value, because the choice between two goods is not a choice over two forms of moral value. It's a choice over social value. So if I save one person or save another, if I save you or Anne because the roof's coming down, it's morally equivalent as to whom I... Sorry?
You haven't answered the question as to what is morally right or wrong.
I'm about to. I'm about to answer your earlier question. I'm answering this one first. Social value, I think, in that decision, the reason why I brought up social value is to say that when you're choosing between saving one person or saving another, or saving 5 IVF embryos or saving a baby, the base on which you might make that decision, which is a choice between saving two kinds of people, and it's essentially equal because you're doing two forms of good. You're not doing an evil thing that a good might come of it, as I would argue is the case in embryo destruction, or in the case of abortion, or in these other cases. You're choosing between two goods. And in that situation, it is licit to say, okay, there's social value here on which I'm going to base this decision between two goods, as opposed to saying, I'm going to destroy one person in order to save another, which does involve you saying, I will deny the moral value of one in order to create another. To save another, or to benefit another in some way. Now, to get to your earlier question, am I a moral realist? I absolutely am. In order to answer fully that would involve going really meta. I'd have to explain exactly why I'm a natural lawyer, why I believe that natural law is the best basis for moral standards. But in any case, the reason why I brought up human rights is actually the reason I actually brought it up very, very, very early on, because my case is essentially based on the fact that moral status is something that proceeds from our nature, that rights are natural rights, and natural rights are human rights by virtue of the fact they proceed from our human nature. So my basis for talking about rights was actually very early on. It was the basis of saying that we are creatures with a rational nature because we have a human nature. Human nature is inherently rational. It has inherent rational capacities and potentialities. And because we possess that nature, we are rational beings. And therefore we are personal beings, and therefore we are persons. and we have all these rights and we have dignity. That's incidentally why I think the gentleman over there hopelessly confused his argument, or the arguments he was making. He didn't recognise the distinction between actual capacities that we have right now, or rather the exercise of actual capacities, or rather immediately exercisable capacities, and the inherent potentiality within human nature. The fact that if I were severely disabled, cannot exercise certain capacities, certain potentialities, does not mean that they are not there within my human nature. Of course they are. By virtue of having human nature, you have rational capacities, you have those rational potentialities, because they're inherent within your nature, because human nature is rational. So,
potentiality mean?
It means that
of someone who is incapable of forming a rational thought.
In that case, they can't actualize their potentiality. The fact is, it's still there because they have a human nature. The base of your saying that we're not, by the way, the same kind of being, the sense of saying that, well, we have all these other bases for saying that we have moral responsibility. Moral responsibility never entered into my argument whatsoever. I couldn't care less about moral responsibility. What I do care about is moral status, moral value, and moral value is something that proceeds from human nature, based on the arguments that I've made. So it absolutely follows that if we have a rational nature, then we have a rational personal nature, therefore we have dignity. It absolutely follows one from the other. The fact we can't exercise them is irrelevant. Going on to, because I've got lots of things here to answer, this is not abstract, this is concrete. I was earlier on it was said, oh, well, you're not really dealing with practical, real moral cases. I absolutely am. What I'm trying to do is form a basis by which we can judge moral cases, and the basis on which I'm doing that is natural rights. Now, when it comes to disability, when it comes to whether a mother's life is in danger, whether it comes to rape, all of these different things, I'm applying the same criteria, and the same criteria applies in all these different cases. Is it right to destroy a human being, an innocent human being, in other words, a human being who has not lost their right to life by having done something evil themselves, like the terrorists in the Middle East or whatever? That's another discussion. If you're applying this right to life, you're applying this natural right based on the dignitarian humanism that I have advocated, then it follows that no, you cannot destroy a human being regardless of what benefit it might bring to us. I wouldn't torture the terrorists to get information out of them. I wouldn't destroy the human being to save even the mother's life or to give her comfort after having been sexually assaulted. And as hard as that is, it's consistent. And I think that the point here is that we have to be consistent if we're going to talk about moral principles, which are the basis for legal principles. If we're going to talk about legal principles and therefore rights, we can't be inconsistent. We can't just have an ad hoc, well, let's be compassionate. I'm sorry, I'm not willing to rely on people's subjective compassion. I think we actually have to have a rational basis for law, a rational basis formed in morality that can therefore be applied in every case. And that's what I am advocating. So this is not abstract, it's entirely concrete. Ideas have consequences, and if you have no absolute ontological basis for the absolute deontology of rights, then you have no rights at all. Philosophy is important, thought is important, and that's why I'm not being subjective and simply situationalistic.
Okay, Anne?
Well, I agree with you that I think that rationality is incredibly important with this. But I think that if you're going to apply rationality, you can't be selective about the way that you apply your rationality, which it seems to me, Peter, is what you're doing. So for example, think for a moment about what you're saying about treating entities and so on according to their potentiality. Now, I don't want to be glib, and John Harris is often very glib, and you know exactly what's coming because you too will have read some of the same books that I've read. He uses a very, very good example where he makes the point that we're all potentially dead, but we don't treat people as though they're dead. Embryos are potentially able to exercise rationality. They're potentially able to have awareness. They're potentially able to be sentient and so on. But that does not mean that we need to treat them as though they are. And this really is, I think, quite important because it's absolutely true. I thought about this really long and hard because I've been doing a lot of work on trying to work out this whole sort of business about what we mean by personhood, actually. It is really hard to try and work out exactly how to try and pin this down in a really mechanistic way and to say, and exactly at what point we are going to say personhood strikes. And I don't think you can do it very easily. I really don't think that there's a glib answer to when does somebody become a person. But the one thing that I can say beyond reasonable doubt, I think anyone can say beyond reasonable doubt, is that the fetus in the womb cannot display those capacities that we would normally apply to personhood. It simply cannot exercise them. Rationally, you cannot apply them, which is why I find it completely rational and completely consistent to say that it is possible to apply a moral standard and to apply treatment to the human entity in that condition that I'm not applying to something that is different, and why I think that it is perfectly possible to say that there are huge moral obligations that we have to women as members of society that we don't have and we don't give to the fetus in the womb. I mean, it is hard, because I think that one of the things that becomes very difficult in this discussion is that it always seems to me that the phrase that comes to mind the whole time is, it begs the question. Because at the end of the day, we do have some very different starting points, I think, on what we think moral standards are and where they think that they should be applied. So, for example, when I think about a moral society, and when I think about a good society, I do think about a society that enables people to make free choices about their lives, to act, to fully employ their rational being, to act as agents in and of themselves, to do what they think is right, without interference from somebody else coming along and saying, you can't do that because I think it's wrong, unless it is going to impinge on the freedom of another person. Now, you clearly, because you define personhood as being equivalent in the womb, that immediately impacts on the way that you will see abortion and actions on the embryo. The fact that I don't means that I look upon your interference with a woman's ability to end a pregnancy under circumstances that she thinks are morally right to do so. I find your wish to restrict that as abhorrent, as you find my acceptance of an assault on the embryo in the womb. And I think that that's ultimately where the fault line lies between us on this, and why there can be no particular meetings. It is actually about how we define what we think is important about people and important about personhood, and where we think the whole thing really fits together. It really is a question that comes back to what it is that makes us human. For you, I think it's DNA and a beating heart. For me, weirdly, it comes down to a kind of secular soul. Now, how weird is that we have switched places on this?